The serial killer family at the Charleston Inn, South Carolina, 1715. In the autumn of 1715, the port town of Charleston, South Carolina, recorded 29 mysterious deaths in just 4 months. What made these deaths particularly disturbing wasn't their number, but the fact that every single victim had been a guest at, or prepared for burial by, the same family-owned inn, the Raven's Rest Inn, owned by the Marlowe family, had served the community for over a decade, renowned for its hospitality, its meticulous care for the deceased, and its compassion for grieving families. But when a traveling physician discovered unusual marks on several bodies during a routine port health inspection, he uncovered evidence that would shake the very foundations of this bustling port town. What authorities discovered in the cellar of the Marlowe establishment was so horrifying that the case files were sealed for nearly a century, and some say the full truth has never been told. Before we continue with the story of the Marlowe family and their inn of horrors, if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most chilling true stories from America's past. Also, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery lovers worldwide. But let me take you back to the bustling port of Charleston in 1715, where the Marlowe family had built a deadly trap under the guise of unimaginable hospitality. Charleston, nestled on the Atlantic coast, was a bustling seaport, the commercial heart of the Carolina colony. With a population of about 500, it attracted sailors, merchants, and settlers from all over the world. The King's Highway ran through the town, the main artery connecting Charleston to the northern colonies, carrying with it both prosperity and tales of pirates and plagues from the ships that docked. Here, trust was the foundation of the community, but a wariness of strangers always simmered beneath the surface. The Marlowe family arrived in Charleston in 1703, claiming to be survivors of a tragic shipwreck off the coast of Virginia. Jacob Marlowe, the head of the family, bought a large wooden inn near the harbor and named it Raven's Rest. Before the Marlowes, travelers often had to find lodging in private homes or sleep aboard their ships. Jacob's professional approach and his hospitality were initially viewed with some suspicion by the locals, but their good food and their warm welcome quickly won the affection of both the town and its visitors. Jacob lived in the inn with his wife Eliza, their 2 sons, Nathaniel and Gideon, their daughter, Ruth, and Eliza's elderly father, Benjamin Voss. The family appeared to be the very embodiment of piety and diligence. Jacob, with his deep, resonant voice, often preached at the local Anglican church. Eliza was famous for her seafood soups and her skill with herbal remedies. Nathaniel, the eldest son at 25, was a talented carpenter. He crafted coffins for those who unfortunately passed away in town. Gideon, 22, handled the heavy labor of digging graves and maintaining the inn. Ruth, just 19, often comforted grieving families with her gentle manner and her prayers, making her an angel in the eyes of many. The Raven's Rest was a 3-story wooden building looming near the harbor, with an adjoining section used as a carpentry workshop. The ground floor was the public taproom and dining hall, where Jacob often told tales of the sea to travelers. The guest and family bedrooms were on the upper floors, but another staircase, cleverly concealed behind the main bar, led down to a large cellar, a cellar that had been converted into an area for preparing bodies and for storage. The property also included a warehouse for goods and a small garden where Eliza grew the herbs she used for cooking and healing. What made the Marlowes especially trusted in a port town fraught with danger was their willingness to help those in distress. They often provided free room and board to shipwrecked sailors or penniless traveling families. This generosity created a solid reputation, and word of their kindness spread on ships up and down the colonies. By 1715, Raven's Rest was not just an inn, it was the last resort for many who had nowhere else to turn. The political climate of Charleston in 1715 was deeply complex. Tensions between European powers, the constant threat from native tribes, and the fear of pirates prowling the coast all created an atmosphere of instability. Outbreaks of diseases like smallpox and yellow fever frequently swept through the town, bringing death and panic. In this atmosphere of chaos and suspicion, institutions like the church and respectable families like the Marlowes represented stability and order. They were the last refuge when the world outside became too dangerous. However, beneath this veneer of hospitality and piety, something sinister was taking root within the Marlowe family. The chaos of a port town, the trust that weary travelers placed in them, and the very nature of running an inn. It created opportunities that most people could never imagine. Death was not just an unfortunate part of life in Charleston. It had become their livelihood and their obsession. And the line between caring for the unfortunate deceased and creating them was about to be crossed in ways that would horrify anyone who discovered the truth. The first sign that something was amiss came on the 12th of October, 1715, when Dr. Edward Langley arrived in Charleston to conduct a routine sanitation inspection of the port. Dr. Langley was a traveling physician employed by the colonial government to monitor disease outbreaks on incoming ships and ensure proper sanitation practices were followed to prevent the spread of epidemics. His visits were routine affairs, typically involving the inspection of merchant ships, warehouses, and public inns. What initially drew Dr. Langley's attention was not the recent number of deaths in Charleston, a sad but not uncommon occurrence in a seaport, but the unusual circumstances he observed. During his mandatory inspection at the Raven's Rest Inn, colonial law required all public establishments to permit a medical examination for any death that occurred on their premises, a regulation strictly enforced after a devastating yellow fever epidemic a few years prior. When Dr. Langley arrived at the Raven's Rest on that windy morning, he was greeted warmly by Jacob Marlowe and his son, Nathaniel. The two men gave him a tour of their inn, proudly pointing out the clean rooms and the tidy kitchen. Everything seemed to be in order, until Dr. Langley requested to examine two bodies they were currently preparing for burial. The first body belonged to James Harrow, a 5-year-old sailor said to have died of malaria 2 days earlier. As Dr. Langley conducted his examination, he noticed something that made him shudder. Along Harrow's neck and arms were tiny needle marks, almost invisible, and around his mouth a slight residue of white powder. These signs were not consistent with malaria. They suggested poisoning. When Dr. Langley questioned these marks, Nathaniel Marlowe quickly explained that it was a folk remedy another sailor had tried on Harrow, a poultice of mixed herbs. The explanation seemed plausible enough in a world full of strange remedies. But something in Nathaniel's demeanor, a tension in his voice, the way his eyes darted towards Jacob, it made Dr. Langley decide to examine the next body more carefully. The second body was that of Margaret Wells, a wealthy 50-year-old female merchant said to have died from complications of smallpox. Dr. Langley's examination revealed something even more disturbing: a small, professionally stitched incision on her abdomen. The cut was too clean. It had nothing to do with a normal funeral preparation. When questioned, Jacob Marlowe claimed that Mrs. Wells had asked them to remove an ugly tumor before her burial, so she could meet her maker in a state of wholeness. But the stitching was too fine, and the reason given was too bizarre. For a family that only performed simple funereal duties, the evidence was becoming clear. These were not natural deaths. The most damning evidence came from the cellar itself. When Dr. Langley requested to inspect the body preparation area, Jacob Marlowe hesitated, but finally he had to lead the way. As the heavy cellar door creaked open, a pungent chemical odor, entirely different from normal herbs, wafted out. The cellar was dark and damp, but what it contained horrified Dr. Langley. Along one wall was a row of large glass jars, containing strange solutions, some of which held preserved human organs. When asked about these specimens, Jacob claimed they were for study, to better understand the ravages of disease that God has sent down, but the organs looked too fresh. Some were sliced with surgical precision, and others showed signs of various poisons. This was not research. It was a morbid collection. As Dr. Langley documented his findings, he became aware of an oppressive atmosphere enveloping the inn. The family members exchanged meaningful glances, their earlier hospitality replaced by a cold watchfulness. Eliza Marlowe, who had been cooking soup in the kitchen, appeared at the doorway, with a smile that now looked like the smirk of a predator. Even young Ruth, who seemed so innocent, watched the proceedings with eyes that held a wisdom and a coldness far beyond her years. Dr. Langley realized he was not just dealing with suspicious individuals, he was dealing with a family, operating as a single, unified entity, hiding a deadly secret. Most disturbing of all was a leather-bound journal, a journal that Dr. Langley noticed, partially hidden under a stack of linen in the cellar. Before he could examine it more closely, Ruth Marlowe quickly moved to block his view, claiming, with an innocent face, that it was her prayer journal. But in the brief glimpse Dr. Langley caught, he saw detailed notes. Notes about various guests, including information about the cargo they carried, their hometowns, and meticulous observations of their health. When the inspection concluded, Dr. Langley found himself in a difficult position. His medical knowledge told him that at least 2 of the recent deaths were due to poisoning, but his evidence was circumstantial, and the Marlowe family was respected throughout the community. Furthermore, as a physician of the colonial government, his accusations against a prominent local family would easily be dismissed by the local sheriff, who had known and trusted the Marlowes for over a decade. That evening, as Dr. Langley prepared his preliminary report at another tavern, he was approached by several sailors and local merchants who had heard about his tense inspection at Raven's Rest. Their conversation revealed a pattern that sent a chill down his spine. In hushed tones, they spoke of the unusual number of travelers who vanished without a trace, the way seemingly healthy individuals would suddenly fall ill and die after just one night's stay, and how the Marlowe family always seemed charitable enough to handle the burials for these unfortunate souls. A particularly disturbing story came from a shipwright, whose close friend, a merchant, had died just a week earlier. He confided that his friend was in perfect health when he arrived in Charleston, but after having dinner at Raven's Rest, he suffered a violent seizure and died. Eliza Marlowe had explained it was due to bad fish, a not uncommon occurrence. The Marlowe family had immediately offered to bury him, waiving all costs out of Christian charity. Dr. Langley was now certain. The Marlowe's charity was a shroud for an unimaginable evil. Dr. Langley's disturbing discoveries in Charleston were not the first time whispers had circulated about the Raven's Rest Inn, though previous rumors had been dismissed or overshadowed by the Marlowe family's charitable reputation. As he dug deeper into the family's history, a pattern of suspicious deaths and disappearances began to emerge, stretching back to their very arrival in Charleston. Over a decade earlier, the Marlowes had come to Charleston from Virginia in 1703. Claiming they were the sole survivors of a horrific shipwreck. They bought the inn from the estate of a merchant who had recently died of yellow fever, paying with a significant amount of gold, which seemed unusually plentiful for a family that had just been through a tragedy. Port records from that time showed that their first year in Charleston was marked by a series of deaths among sailors and travelers, attributed to strange fevers from the sea, all of whom were handled and buried by the Marlowe family. Over the years, locals had occasionally remarked on the strange circumstances surrounding deaths at Raven's Rest. Sailors would recount tales of shipmates who seemed healthy, but then declined rapidly after just one night. How eager the Marlowe family was to handle all arrangements, and how they discouraged bringing in other physicians from town. But in a dangerous port city, where death was a daily occurrence, such observations were dismissed as unfortunate coincidences. The cellar of Raven's Rest held secrets that would have horrified the town had they been discovered. Behind a false wall that Dr. Langley had not detected during his initial inspection, the family maintained what could only be described as a laboratory of death. Wooden shelves held jars of poisons, extracted from herbs and sea creatures, surgical instruments far more sophisticated than any funereal preparation would require, and a collection of human skulls, etched with bizarre symbols. The most damning evidence was the complete version of the journal Dr. Langley had glimpsed. This leather-bound tome contained meticulous records of every guest who had died in their inn, along with detailed observations on the effectiveness of various poisons and methods of inducing death. The entries, written mostly in Ruth's elegant script, revealed a systematic approach to murder, an approach that had been perfected through careful practice and observation. Under Jacob's fanatical direction, the journal documented not just the methods of killing, but also the careful selection of victims. The Marlowes had developed a keen understanding of the port's comings and goings, identifying individuals whose disappearance would be least noticed, sailors without a captain to report to, lone merchants without partners, and the sick without family. These were preferred targets. The family had also learned to space their activities among genuine disease outbreaks, ensuring that the deaths they caused were merely seen as part of a larger tragedy. One particularly chilling entry, written in Ruth's elegant script, described the murder of James Harrow in clinical detail. Harrow was chosen because he was a sailor who had just left his ship, was not expected by anyone, and because he had boasted about the gold in his pouch. The entry noted that Harrow was lured to a private room, under the guise of receiving special care for his fever. Once there, he was bound and subjected to what the journal euphemistically termed purification by holy medicine, before being killed, and his body staged to look like a death from malaria. The family's motive appeared to be a complex mixture of financial gain, psychological satisfaction, and a twisted religious conviction. They regularly robbed their victims of gold, goods, and valuables. But this seemed secondary to Jacob's apparent obsession with cleansing souls. Several journal entries discussed their experiments with different poisons, their observations of how different individuals reacted to fear and pain, and their efforts to perfect methods that mimicked the symptoms of common epidemics. Eliza Marlowe emerged from the journal entries as the most cunning member of the family. Her specialty was brewing poisons, odorless and tasteless, into her famous seafood soup. She had an ability to identify the most vulnerable guests, those who were lonely and craved a bit of kindness. Her motherly appearance and reputation for healing skills made her the perfect predator, able to deliver a lethal bowl of soup without arousing the slightest suspicion. The children had been gradually inducted into the family's activities as they matured. Ruth, despite her youth and innocent appearance, had become adept at identifying potential victims at the harbor, reporting back to her family about travelers who seemed wealthy, alone, or without connections. Both sons had developed expertise in the physical aspects of the crime. Nathaniel, the carpenter, was responsible for building the hidden mechanisms and sturdy coffins, while Gideon, with his brute strength, learned to overpower victims and transport bodies quietly. What made the Marlowe's operation particularly sinister was their integration into Charleston's social fabric. They attended church services, donated to the poor, and maintained friendships with many of the most powerful officials and merchants in town. This double life required a level of psychological compartmentalization that suggested either inherent psychopathy or a fanatical religious fervor that had consumed the entire family. The autumn of 1715 marked an escalation in their activities, driven by both opportunity and growing confidence. A mild epidemic had provided the perfect cover for their activities. At the same time, the family's success in avoiding detection had made them increasingly bold, leading to the spike in deaths that had finally attracted Dr. Langley's attention. Dr. Langley faced a dilemma that would test both his professional integrity and his personal courage. His examination had revealed clear evidence of foul play, but presenting his findings to the local sheriff would require him to accuse a respected family of mass murder, a charge that would seem incredible to a community that had trusted the Marlowes for over a decade. Furthermore, as a physician of the colony, his authority was limited, and challenging a family as influential as the Marlowes could easily ruin his career and even cost him his life. The solution came from an unexpected source. The next night in Charleston, Dr. Langley was approached by Benjamin Voss, Eliza Marlowe's elderly father, who requested a private medical consultation. The old man claimed to be tormented by a devil's colic and asked Dr. Langley to examine him at a secluded warehouse on the docks. They met under the dim light of a lantern, where Voss's demeanor immediately changed, from that of a feeble patient to one of desperation and calculation. "Doctor," Voss whispered, his eyes darting nervously into the darkness, I know what you found during your inspection yesterday. The needle marks, the stitches, the unnatural deaths. You are right to be suspicious, but you do not understand the full scale of the madness in that inn. What Benjamin Voss revealed to Dr. Langley over the next hour painted a picture of evil, an evil that exceeded even the physician's growing suspicions. Voss explained that he had been slowly poisoned by his own daughter and son-in-law for several months, experiencing the same symptoms that had preceded the deaths of several recent guests. His advanced age and declining health had made him an ideal test subject for Eliza's poisons, but his survival instinct and surreptitious observations had allowed him to identify and counteract their attempts on his life. According to Voss, the family's activities had begun as simple robbery. Soon after arriving in Charleston, Jacob realized that many travelers carried valuable assets and had no one to protect them. This initial criminal activity, combined with Jacob's fanatical religious beliefs, gradually evolved into something far more sinister. As the family realized they could hide their robberies by staging deaths to look like the result of disease, they weren't just robbing the dead, they were creating the dead to rob. The turning point came in 1705, when the family accidentally caused the death of a drunken sailor they were trying to rob. Instead of facing exposure, they staged the scene to look like he died from alcohol poisoning. They were astonished to find the victim's death was readily accepted by the community as a regrettable accident. This success led to increasingly bold experiments in murder, with each family member developing specialized skills and roles in their criminal enterprise, all shrouded in Jacob's twisted faith. Voss revealed that Ruth's journal contained detailed records of 29 murders committed over the past 10 years, with victims carefully selected from those coming and going from the port to avoid detection. The family had developed a network of informants among the ne'er-do-wells at the docks, who would alert them to potential targets: merchants carrying large sums of gold, sailors without a captain, or anyone whose disappearance might not be immediately investigated. What made Voss's testimony particularly credible was his intimate knowledge of the family's methods and his ability to provide specific details about recent victims that Dr. Langley had examined. He described exactly how James Harrow had been injected with poison, how Margaret Wells had been surgically cut open after death to retrieve valuables hidden in her clothing, and how other victims had been slowly poisoned with Eliza's soup, while she pretended to care for them through fictitious illnesses. The old man also revealed the existence of a mass grave, hidden in the dunes near the harbor, where the family disposed of victims whose bodies showed too many signs of violence to be explained away. This burial site, according to Voss, contained the remains of at least 15 individuals, including several travelers who had stopped at Raven's Rest for a night's shelter and were never seen again. Voss's motive for betraying his family was both personal and practical. He was increasingly horrified by Jacob's fanaticism and Eliza's cruelty, but more importantly, he had realized that his own death was imminent. The family had grown tired of caring for him, and recent conversations had made it clear that his usefulness as a test subject was coming to an end. His only hope for survival was to expose their crimes and seek protection from the authorities. The old man proposed a plan that would allow Dr. Langley to gather irrefutable evidence while protecting both of them from immediate retaliation. Voss would provide the physician with a brass key to a secret compartment in the cellar, where the journal and the map were kept. He advised Langley to act the next day, when the Marlowe family would be absent at the Anglican church for service. This would give Dr. Langley the documentation he needed to convince the sheriff. While Voss would use the same opportunity to board a ship heading north, Dr. Langley spent the rest of the night wrestling with the implications of Voss's revelations. The scope of the crimes was staggering, involving dozens of murders, committed over a decade, by a family that was trusted and respected by the port town. The evidence Voss promised would likely be enough to secure convictions, but it would also destroy the illusion of safety in a community already fraught with danger, where trust in one's neighbor was one of the few things left. More troubling was the realization that Dr. Langley himself was now in danger. His inspection had clearly aroused the Marlowe family's suspicions, and his continued presence in Charleston was a threat to their operation. Voss warned that the family had killed to protect their secrets before, and they would not hesitate to do so again if they felt cornered. The plan they devised required precise timing and considerable courage. Dr. Langley would need to get into the cellar, find the secret compartment, and retrieve the journal and map before the family realized what had happened. Meanwhile, Voss would disappear on a ship, making it seem as if he had simply left town, a not uncommon occurrence in a bustling seaport. The next morning, the Charleston sky was grey and windy, with the chill of the Atlantic seeming to seep into the very cobblestones of the streets as residents prepared for church services. Dr. Langley had spent a sleepless night at the tavern, alternately reviewing his medical notes and questioning the recklessness of the plan he was about to undertake. The weight of the horrifying evidence hidden in the cellar of Raven's Rest pressed on his mind, made heavier by the knowledge that his own life now hung in the balance. Benjamin Voss had given him detailed instructions on how to enter the inn and find the secret compartment in the cellar while the family was away. The Marlowes, as devout members of the Anglican Church, never missed service and often stayed to socialize with dignitaries afterward. This would provide Dr. Langley a precious window of time to act and bring the evidence to Sheriff Ward. The old, heavy brass key Voss had given him was designed to open a hidden compartment beneath the cellar's rotting floorboards. According to the old man, this compartment held not only the complete murder journal, but also Eliza's most potent poisons and a detailed map showing the location of the mass grave in the dunes, where dozens of victims had been disposed of over the years. As the church bells began to toll across Charleston, Dr. Langley positioned himself in an alley across from the inn, watching the Marlowe family emerge in their finest attire. Jacob wore a formal black suit, giving him the look of a respectable preacher, while Eliza wore a grey dress with a white shawl that emphasized her matronly appearance. Nathaniel and Gideon walked on either side of their parents, looking every bit the diligent sons, while Ruth walked demurely beside her mother, her innocent appearance masking the coldness Voss had described. What Dr. Langley found most disturbing was how normal the family appeared as they walked towards the church. Their faces showed no trace of the fanaticism and cruelty Voss had described, no hint that they had murdered dozens of innocent people. They nodded to neighbors, smiled at playing children, and presented themselves as a model of piety and diligence. The physician waited a full 30 minutes after the family's departure before approaching the inn. The wooden building stood silent and menacing under the morning light, its walls holding secrets that would shock the entire colony if they were revealed. Dr. Langley's hand trembled slightly as he slipped in through the back door, but his medical training had prepared him to confront horrific realities, and he forced himself to proceed methodically. The cellar at first appeared exactly as it had during his inspection, dark, damp, and filled with common funereal tools. The boards used to lay out bodies were clean, and a few empty coffins rested peacefully in the corner. It was only when Dr. Langley began carefully examining the floor that he found the secret compartment Voss had described. Behind a loose board, under an old workbench, the brass key opened a trapdoor, revealing a smaller subcellar, a space of horrors beyond his worst imaginings. This secret cellar was the Marlowe family's true laboratory. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and decay. Wooden shelves along the walls held dozens of poison vials, carefully labeled with names and dosages, alongside bloody surgical tools. But most horrifying was the murder journal. Placed reverently on a small table in the center of the room, the leather-bound tome was thick with years of entries, written in Ruth's elegant script, but with a clinical attention to detail that spoke of a sick methodology applied to the act of murder. Under Jacob's direction, next to the journal, lay the map to the mass grave, meticulously drawn. Dr. Langley's medical knowledge allowed him to understand the technical aspects of what he was reading, but the clinical precision with which Ruth had documented the family's crimes was perhaps more horrifying than the murders themselves. Each entry followed a similar format: description of the victim, method of approach, type and dosage of poison used, observations of the victim's convulsions and reactions, and notes for future improvements. The entries showed a progression from simple poisonings to increasingly complex concoctions, suggesting years of practice and refinement. Some recent entries even described experimental cuts made on victims to see how they reacted to pain. What shocked Dr. Langley most was the discovery that the family's activities were not just limited to those who died in the inn. The journal recorded plans to target wealthy merchants and officials in town. They had developed a system for identifying vulnerable individuals within the Charleston community, often waiting for the perfect opportunity, a long trip, an illness, to strike in places where they were least likely to be suspected. The marginal notes were even more disturbing than the main entries. Jacob's short comments, written in a shaky hand, were filled with twisted biblical quotes to justify his actions. He saw his victims not as human beings, but as souls in need of purification, approaching murder with the same sick fervor a missionary might use to save souls. The Marlowe family were not just serial killers, they were fanatics, waging their own private holy war. As Dr. Langley continued to examine the secret cellar, hastily stuffing the journal and map into his coat pocket, he became aware of voices. Outside the inn, glancing through a crack in the wall, he realized with growing panic that the Marlowe family was returning. The church service had ended much earlier than expected. The voices grew louder, and he recognized the deep, resonant tone of Jacob Marlowe as they entered the inn. Panic seized Dr. Langley as he realized his perilous situation. He was trapped in the secret cellar with damning evidence of the family's crimes, and they would surely kill him if they discovered his presence. The voices drew closer, and he could hear footsteps on the wooden floor directly above his head. His only escape was through the trapdoor, which would put him directly in their line of sight. Hiding in the cellar was only a temporary solution. Sooner or later, they would come down. Just when we thought Dr. Langley's investigation might expose the horrible truth about the Marlowe family, the situation takes a deadly turn. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. In this inn of horrors, in his desperate search for another escape route, Dr. Langley noticed a faint, cold draft coming from behind a stack of old coffins. At the far end of the cellar, partially obscured, was another rickety wooden door. A door that seemed to lead to a different space. With the family's voices directly overhead, he had no choice but to risk exploring this unknown passage, hoping it might lead to freedom, rather than deeper into the nightmare he had uncovered. The door led to a damp tunnel, shored up with rough wooden beams that stretched towards the harbor. The smell of salt and decay mingled together. As he moved through the tunnel, by the dim light of the lantern he carried, the physician began to understand the true scale of the Marlowe family's operation. This was the path they used to transport the bodies to the dunes. The tunnel ended at an exit, cleverly camouflaged behind a pile of old fishing nets, right at the edge of the sandy dunes. And it was here, under the pale moonlight, that he saw it, the mass grave. Human bones, bleached white, protruded from the wind-swept sand. Some skeletons still clinging to tattered pieces of clothing. Some were buried individually. Others were simply thrown on top of each other. The smell of death and the sea was overwhelming, but Dr. Langley's medical training allowed him to examine the scene with professional detachment. Despite his utter horror, this was the final, physical proof he needed. What he discovered in the dunes revealed the full extent of the family's crimes. The remains of at least 15 individuals were visible, but Langley knew there were more hidden beneath the sand, representing over a decade of systematic murder. Some skeletons showed evidence of the surgical cuts recorded in the journal, while others seemed to have just been discarded. Personal effects scattered among the remains: a sailor's belt buckle, scraps of silk from a merchant woman's dress, foreign coins. They indicated that robbery was indeed a significant motive for many of the murders. Most disturbing was an area near the tunnel exit, where the bodies of the two most recent victims, James Harrow and Margaret Wells, had been shallowly buried. Dr. Langley recognized their clothing, confirming that the Marlowes had systematically murdered their guests. The carelessness in burying these bodies suggested the family had become arrogant and reckless, perhaps believing no one would ever dare to suspect them. As Dr. Langley hurried back into the tunnel, he heard voices echoing from the direction of the inn. The Marlowes had discovered the disturbance in their secret cellar. Multiple voices called out, but their tone was not one of concern. It was the patient, predatory sound of hunters pursuing cornered prey. Jacob and his sons were entering the tunnel, cutting off his only escape route, the dark tunnel. It had now become a trap. Blocked at both ends, Dr. Langley noticed a narrow side passage. An air tunnel the Marlowes had likely dug to reduce the stench. He desperately squeezed into it, crawling through the tight space, and finally emerging into another alley, several blocks away from the inn. From this temporary safe position, he could see Jacob and his two sons searching the area around the inn, moving with the terrifying calm of men who had conducted such hunts before. It was clear that Dr. Langley was not the first to discover their secrets, and the methodical way they scoured the area suggested that previous inquisitive individuals had not survived their discoveries. The physician's escape from the clutches of the Marlowes required all his wits and considerable luck. He could not go back for his belongings. With the journal and map tucked securely in his coat, he ran to the office of Sheriff Ward, avoiding the main streets where the Marlowes might be looking for him. His evidence was enough to convince anyone, but he needed to get there before the Marlowe family realized their prey had escaped and decided to silence him permanently. What Dr. Langley didn't know was that Benjamin Voss had not escaped as planned. The old man had been spotted by Ruth as he tried to sneak onto a ship, and had been confronted by his family about his betrayal. Under threat, Voss had revealed everything about his arrangement with Dr. Langley, including the physician's plan to retrieve the evidence and expose them to the sheriff. This revelation had prompted the family to return to the inn earlier than intended and begin their search for Dr. Langley. More ominously, it had convinced Jacob that their time in Charleston was over. Instead of simply eliminating Dr. Langley and continuing their operations, they decided to burn the inn, erase all traces, and flee to another colony where they could start anew. The Marlowes' escape from Charleston was planned as ruthlessly and swiftly as their crimes. That evening, while Dr. Langley was trying to convince a skeptical sheriff, a great fire erupted from Raven's Rest. They claimed a lantern had overturned, a tragic accident. They stood among the crowd, weeping and wailing over their loss. To most of the community, this was a tragedy that had befallen a respectable family, requiring their sympathy and support. But in reality, it was a perfectly staged performance to destroy evidence and create a cover story for their disappearance. What the townspeople didn't realize was that the fire was not an accident, but a methodical act of destroying evidence. The flames consumed the cellar and the secret sub-cellar, turning all remaining evidence to ash. By the time Dr. Langley and Sheriff Ward finally arrived with an armed party, the Marlowe family had vanished in the chaos, leaving behind only a smoldering ruin and a community that would never suspect the horrors that had been committed in their midst. Dr. Langley's account, though supported by the journal and map, was met with skepticism. The fire had destroyed all physical evidence at the inn. When investigators dug in the dunes, they found only a few skeletons, not enough to prove the scale of the crimes described in the journal. Many suggested the journal was the product of a sick imagination, perhaps belonging to Dr. Langley himself, or the young, mentally disturbed Ruth Marlowe. The subsequent investigation was hampered by the community's resistance to believing such terrible things about the Marlowe family. Church dignitaries and reputable merchants provided attestations to the Marlowe's good character, insisting they were respectable members of the community who could not possibly have committed the crimes Dr. Langley described. With no family to question, and with most physical evidence destroyed by the fire, the colonial authorities were forced to conclude that while suspicious circumstances existed, there was insufficient proof to warrant a massive intercolonial manhunt. Benjamin Voss's disappearance was explained by the Marlowes before they fled, as him having boarded a ship back to England. No trace of him was ever found, and his fate remained officially unknown, though Dr. Langley had no doubt that Voss had paid the ultimate price for his attempt to expose his family's crimes, his body likely consumed by the flames. The aftermath of Dr. Langley's discoveries haunted both him and the community of Charleston for years to come. The physician submitted detailed reports and copies of the journal to the colonial authorities, but with no Marlowe family to question and most physical evidence destroyed, the case was eventually classified as inconclusive and sealed away. Dr. Langley never stopped believing what he had witnessed. and he spent considerable personal resources trying to track the Marlowe family. His inquiries revealed a pattern of infires and suspicious deaths in other port cities along the coast, from Savannah to Philadelphia. But by the time he could alert authorities in those areas, the family had presumably vanished again. He was always too late to prevent further murders or capture the perpetrators. The people of Charleston were left to grapple with the possibility that they had lived alongside fanatical murderers for over a decade. Some residents refused to believe Dr. Langley's account, insisting the Marlowes were victims of a tragic accident and a vicious slander. Others began to re-examine past deaths with new suspicion, wondering how many sailors, merchants, and travelers had actually been murdered, instead of dying from disease. The foundation of the Raven's Rest Inn stood as a charred scar near the harbor for many years. Before it was finally cleared to build a new warehouse, locals avoided the plot of land, and ghost stories of screams in the night began to spread. Perhaps most tragically, the fear and suspicion created by the Marlowe affair fundamentally changed the character of Charleston. The open trust in strangers, which was part of the dynamic of a port town, was replaced by vigilance and suspicion. Innkeepers began to look at their guests with doubt. Death by disease, already frightening, now carried a new terror, and the fabric of the community was permanently torn. Dr. Langley continued his work as a colonial physician, but he was forever changed by what he had witnessed in Charleston. He developed an almost obsessive attention to detail during his inspections, examining every death in a public establishment with the thoroughness of a criminal investigator. His colleagues and superiors began to see him as eccentric, even paranoid, but Dr. Langley knew. He knew that evil could hide behind the most pious of facades. In 1735, a full 20 years after his experience in Charleston, Dr. Langley received a letter that would vindicate his long-held beliefs and provide a final chilling chapter to the Marlowe story. The letter came from a magistrate in New Orleans, another bustling seaport to the south, where a new wave of settlement had brought both honest folk and opportunists. According to the magistrate's account, a family named Dubois had been running a small inn and chapel in the French Quarter of New Orleans for 5 years, before being exposed under circumstances identical to what Dr. Langley had discovered in Charleston. The magistrate, during his investigation, had found Dr. Langley's old reports in the colonial archives and recognized the identical patterns of suspicious deaths by fever, systematic poisoning, and victims robbed of all their possessions. When authorities finally raided the Dubois establishment, they found a poison laboratory and evidence of at least 20 murders committed during their 5 years in New Orleans. More importantly, they discovered personal effects identified as belonging to victims from Charleston, proving that the Dubois family was, in fact, the Marlowe family, who had moved south, established a new identity, and continued their murderous practices. The family was captured alive, and during their interrogation, they confessed to crimes spanning more than 20 years and covering multiple port cities. Their total victim count exceeded 60 individuals, making them one of the most terrifying serial killer families in colonial history. Jacob Marlowe, now calling himself Jean-Luc Dubois, was over 60 years old, but remained fanatical and showed no remorse for his crimes, insisting he was carrying out God's will. Eliza, Nathaniel, Gideon, and Ruth had all continued their roles in the family operation, refining their techniques and changing their methods to suit their new environment. The family's confession revealed the full scope of their crimes and provided closure for dozens of unsolved disappearances along the coast. They described in detail how they had perfected their system of selecting victims, establishing credibility in new communities, and disposing of evidence. Most chillingly, Jacob still expressed pride in his mission, seeing himself as God's executioner, tasked with cleansing the world of sinners. Jacob Marlowe was executed by hanging in the Place d'Armes in New Orleans in the summer of 1736, followed by his 2 sons, Nathaniel and Gideon. Eliza, who had attempted suicide but failed, was sentenced to life imprisonment in a convent and died of disease a few years later. Ruth, who had partially cooperated and claimed to have been coerced by her father, received a 20-year sentence, but vanished from prison records, her fate remaining a mystery. The revelation of the true scope of the Marlowe family's crimes sent shockwaves through the port communities where they had operated. Families who had trusted them in their most vulnerable moments realized they had been in the presence of calculating murderers. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of placing blind trust in those who wear a cloak of piety. Dr. Langley, now in his 62nd, traveled to New Orleans to witness Jacob Marlowe's execution and to finally confront the man who had haunted his thoughts for 2 decades. The two men spoke briefly before the execution, and Jacob expressed surprise that Dr. Langley had survived his discovery in Charleston, stating that God had other plans for you. In their final conversation, Jacob revealed one last disturbing detail. He claimed that he was not the only one to receive this mission. He spoke of other disciples who had learned his methods and established their own chapels in other port cities. He claimed that at least 2 other families were continuing God's work, but he refused to provide any details that might help authorities locate them. This revelation ensured that Dr. Langley's remaining years would be spent in the knowledge that the evil he had discovered in Charleston was just one branch of a fanatical and deadly network still spreading through the colonies. The community of Charleston, though it continued to prosper, never fully recovered from the revelation that their pious neighbors had been fanatical murderers. The charred foundation of Raven's Rest became a grim reminder, and suspicion was sown in the heart of a town already fraught with danger. Today, the records of the Marlowe family's crimes remain largely sealed or lost. The official reports are buried in colonial archives. The word-of-mouth tales have turned into ghostly legends, and the community tried to erase all memory of their presence. But for those who study the darker chapters of American colonial history, the Marlowe case serves as a reminder that evil can flourish anywhere, hidden behind masks of piety, and protected by the very trust and desperation it seeks to exploit. The story of the Raven's Rest Inn shows how serial killers could operate with impunity. In an era when disease and violence were commonplace, it shows how predators could exploit natural human trust, using hospitality as a weapon against their victims. Most importantly, it reveals how ordinary people, physicians, witnesses, even members of the criminal family, sometimes hold the power to expose great evils, but only if they are willing to look beyond appearances and act on their suspicions. Dr. Langley spent his final years documenting everything he had learned about the Marlowe case, hoping that his records might someday help other authorities recognize similar patterns of crime in other port cities. He passed away in 1748. Taking with him the intimate knowledge of one of America's most horrifyingly fanatical criminal families. His detailed notes were discovered among his papers and eventually made their way into the archives, where they remain today, as a testament to crimes that shocked even a world that was all too familiar with death. The legacy of the Marlowe family extends beyond their immediate victims to encompass the fundamental changes they brought to every community they touched. They destroyed the fragile sense of security in a chaotic world, replacing trust with suspicion and piety with fear. In this way, their impact on the colonies extended far beyond the individuals they murdered, touching the very fabric of community life in a burgeoning new world. This mystery shows us how easily evil can masquerade as piety, and how the very institutions we turn to for shelter in our most perilous hours can sometimes harbor our worst nightmares. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Marlowe family's crimes, or might there have been even darker secrets and other disciples that died with them forever? Leave your comment below and let us know if you've heard similar stories from your own region's history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. The past holds many secrets, and we'll continue exploring them together. See you in the next video.